Chapter 14. Intuition. We know more than we understand. Agatha Christie said of intuition, "You can't ignore it, and you can't explain it." But we don't need a pat explanation to recognize how important it is and investigate how we can develop ours to its maximum potential. Despite the efforts of psychologists and neurologists, human thought is still best described by metaphor, poetry, and other literary devices we use to express what we do not fully understand. Not being a poet, I will keep my focus on the more practical mission of understanding what we might call executive brain management. Aldous Huxley, ignoring Freud and writing long before the invention of brain scans, defined experience as a matter of sensibility and intuition, of seeing and hearing the significant things, of paying attention at the right moments, of understanding and coordinating. Experience is not what happens to a man, it is what a man does with what happens to him. All along, this has been a program about taking action, about playing an active and focused role in our own development. Because the truth is that we can't sit around and expect wisdom to accumulate along with gray hair. I've talked about the importance of learning from your mistakes, but in truth that's almost a passive act, at least in comparison to actively going out in search of new experiences that will teach you new and extraordinary things. Learning from our mistakes is the least we should ask from ourselves. To get more, we must demand it and go looking for it. Intuition is where it all comes together. It is the indispensable product of our experience, our knowledge, and our will to know and do more. It's my opinion that, contrary to popular belief, we cannot truly experience the spark of intuition in a field in which we have little practical knowledge. The first-time chess player who makes the right move based on his feeling for a certain piece is probably experiencing luck, not intuition. But when a knowledgeable player finds the best move simply present in his mind, without combing through hundreds of variations, that's the power of intuition. Even the vaguest of hunches is based on something tangible, some knowledge even though it may be buried deep below our conscious mind. A positive impression of a new coworker can stem from a deeply embedded recollection of another's voice, face, or name. That we cannot explain or understand it does not mean that this powerful force of recollected knowledge does not exist. Discussing the complexity of human intuition reminds me of the dilemma that was summed up by the one-time head of the Spanish royal household, Sabino Fernandez Campo, who said, "What I can tell you is not interesting, and what is interesting, I cannot tell you." So instead of theory, I had best stick to concrete examples that might help me convince you to have more faith in your instincts. This is the essential element that cannot be measured by any analysis or device, and I believe it's at the heart of success in all things, the power of intuition and the ability to harness and use it like a master. Intuition versus analysis. After I wrote a series of short newspaper articles on the world champions who came before me, I became obsessed with the idea of analyzing in depth how the game has changed over the decades, and how its development has been pushed along by its greatest practitioners. I had in mind a biography of chess itself, told through the careful analysis of the greatest and most influential games. This project, which has taken up a large part of my life for the past 3 years, came to life as a series of books titled My Great Predecessors. During my work on My Great Predecessors, I gained not just deeper respect for the achievements of the world champions, but a greater admiration for the ways that the game of chess can bring out the best in the human mind. Few activities are as taxing to our faculties as a professional chess tournament. Memory is in overdrive, rapid calculation is essential, the outcome hangs on every move, and a match goes on for hour after hour, day after day, all with the world watching. It is the ideal scenario for mental and physical meltdown. When I began to analyze the games of my world champion forebears, I was therefore prepared to be a little forgiving, not in my analysis, but in my attitude toward their mistakes. Here I was in the 21st century, standing on the shoulders of giants with gigahertz of chess processing power at my fingertips. With these advantages and the objectivity of hindsight, I shouldn't judge my predecessors too harshly, I told myself, even as I would hope, years from now, to receive some forgiveness for the mistakes I made in the heat of competition. An important part of the project was to collect all the relevant analysis that had been done on these games before, especially the published analyses of the players themselves and their contemporaries. The principal theme of the series is to illustrate the evolution of the game, so the commentary of the time is as valuable as the games themselves in revealing the mentality of the players of each era. One would assume that the analyst, working in the calm of his study and with unlimited time to move the pieces, would have a much easier job than the players themselves. Hindsight is 20/20 after all, or so we are told. To my surprise, I found that when other top players in the pre-computer age, before 1995 roughly, wrote about games in magazines and newspaper columns, they often made more mistakes in their annotations than the players had made at the board. Hindsight, it seemed, was badly in need of bifocals. Even when the players themselves published an analysis of their own games, they often were less perceptive than they had been while actually playing the game. Here's an example of how a herd of experts failed to see, decade after decade, how human intuition triumphed in the crucial moment. Game 7 was the decisive encounter of the 1894 World Championship match between the 57-year-old champion Wilhelm Steinitz and his young German challenger, 25-year-old Emanuel Lasker. The players had split the first 4 games 2 wins apiece, followed by 2 draws. Then came what the commentators at the time predicted was lucky number 7. Which of the players would be the lucky one is perhaps not yet clear to this day. Lasker misplayed early on with the white pieces, and Steinitz exploited his chances so effectively that he had a clean pair of extra pawns when the smoke cleared at move 20. If a grandmaster today resigned in such a position, it wouldn't provoke much surprise among the viewing public. Play was much less precise a century ago, and of course, Lasker had nothing to lose by playing on. At the very least, he would tire out his elder opponent for the next encounter. Already a shrewd psychologist of the chessboard, Lasker likely hoped that the sheer bravado of his decision to press on would disturb the dogmatic veteran. Most analyses of the game at the time went something like this. Steinitz, as black, had a clearly winning position. Lasker launched a desperate attack under black's king, sacrificing a piece. Still winning, but now under some pressure, Steinitz committed a suicidal mistake that cost him the game. The shock of blundering so badly affected Steinitz so much that he went on to lose the next 4 games in a row and the world title. At least, that's the official story. But there's another way to see the game. The revised story would go something like this. Steinitz had an objectively winning position, but he made a few errors. And those errors allowed Lasker to launch a risky but brilliant attack, making the position quite complicated. The challenger's subsequent play and piece sacrifice set many practical problems for black. Under constant pressure, Steinitz failed to defend accurately and lost. Steinitz's final mistake came in a position where he was already losing. The psychological blow of being outplayed despite his superficially simple and winning position stunned Steinitz, and he was unable to recover in the match. More than his self-confidence had been shaken by the loss. The principles of sound and logical chess that Steinitz held so dear had seemingly betrayed him. He was sure he had been winning, and he had played according to his philosophy. And yet, he had lost. The result may have been the same either way, but there is a world of difference in getting the story right. A veteran master such as Steinitz would not have been so damaged by a mere oversight, no matter how grave its consequences. All chess players know chess blindness can strike anyone at any time. What shook Steinitz was that he hadn't blundered. The game had been taken out of his grip by the young Lasker's energetic play. We can tell from the way the game progressed that Lasker could not have seen all the way to the end of every variation, but he didn't have to. His intuition told him he would have good practical chances. How could so many strong players miss in analysis what Lasker sensed during the game? Even Lasker himself never challenged the official story in his later observations, but his intuition had led him unfailingly and correctly during the game. It turns out that this is not at all unusual, even a century later, in my own games and analysis, as well as others. For starters, it is impossible for the analyst sitting in his comfortable study to replicate the level of concentration reached during a game. The freedom we have in analysis to move the pieces around can be a crutch that leads us to use our eyes instead of our minds. When seated at the board, we have no choice but to focus our full powers. Over and over again, these legendary figures, at the most crucial moments of their careers, intuitively found the best moves. Competitive pressure made them push deeper. Those of us who come along later and apply all our skills and knowledge to the analysis of the moves aren't under that pressure. Some of our senses are turned off, and we become like a sighted person who is midway through learning Braille. We perceive the information that's in front of us under our fingertips, but we can't fully understand it. The things we usually think of as advantages, having more time to think and analyze, having more information at our disposal, can short-circuit what matters even more, our intuition. How long is long enough? This example is not intended to encourage you to blindly follow your gut instinct or to rely indiscriminately on simple first impressions. As we've seen over and over, diligent study and the gathering of knowledge about what came before in chess are essential to becoming a successful competitor. What I do want to illustrate is the power of concentration and instinct. The biggest problem I see among people who want to excel in chess, and in business and in life in general, is not trusting these instincts enough. Too often they rely on having all the information, which then forces them to a conclusion. This effectively reduces them to the role of a microprocessor and guarantees that their intuition will remain dormant. Everything comes at a cost. Challenging yourself in new ways inevitably leads to a few failures. At times, your instincts will all point in one direction, and that direction is a dead end. So you err, you learn, you make fewer mistakes, you gain more confidence, you trust your instincts more readily, and you continue the cycle. The result of trying anything is either failure or success. If you wish to succeed, you must brave the risk of failure. When the dot-com bubble began to expand in the 1990s, it set off the alarm bells of just about every old economy analyst. Surely this couldn't be real. Companies without revenue simply were not worth billions of dollars of market capital. 5 years later, after the markets had plummeted and thousands of companies had gone bankrupt, it was easy to say that those sober analysts had been correct all along. They trusted their intuition and stayed well away from the wild side of the tech market, while so many others had closed the traditional playbook, jumped all the way in, and got badly burned. But were the conservative doomsayers really right? Sure, it takes discipline to resist jumping into the pool when all the other kids are doing it. But after a while, it can become a habit, and you never jump in at all. Some credit should be given to the few who played it well, whose fine intuitive senses told them to first go in, and second, just how long to stay in. For all the famous disaster stories, and my own dot-com venture is somewhere on that list, plenty of investors ran into the burning building, filled their pockets with internet gold, and got out before it collapsed. The conservative crowd was right on the fundamentals, but that didn't mean there wasn't money to be made by a savvy few. Any discipline in which access to information is nearly unlimited, but time is a major factor, has a strong intuitive element. Stock analysts search for visual patterns in stock charts, shapes such as teacups and rising wedges, the way chess players look for checkmating patterns. Intuition tells us not just what and how, but also when. I can ponder my move for 10 seconds, 10 minutes, or 1 hour. A well-developed intuition lets me know when I have reached a critical juncture that requires more time and special attention. As they develop, our instincts, our intuitive senses, become labor-saving and time-saving devices. They literally cut down the time it takes to make a proper evaluation and act. You can collect and analyze new information forever without ever making a decision. Something has to tell you when the law of diminishing returns is kicking in. And that something is intuition. The perils of ignoring a trend. The pattern recognition that chess players rely on is essential in every walk of life. In every new situation, we have to determine whether what we are dealing with is a trend or something unique. Detecting trends, preferably before anyone else, is often based on intuition and intangible elements. Has it happened before? Will it develop the same way this time? Figuring out whether an event is a one-off, a new trend, or an old trend in new clothes is especially important in the political world. During every election season, the media reports a half-dozen new paradigms, although few turn out to be both new and relevant. In the U.S. presidential election in 2004, the Democrats looked back at Al Gore's defeat in 2000 and chose the wrong man as John Kerry's running mate. The choice of John Edwards might have made sense in the Kerry campaign headquarters, but if you looked at the trends that were evident from the country's electoral map, it made no sense at all. Bush had dominated the South in the 2000 election, and there was no reason to believe that Edwards could carry even a single Southern state for the Democrats. On Election Day 2004, the Democratic Blues again lost the entire South. They even lost Edwards' home state of North Carolina by the same 13 points Gore had lost it by in 2000. To further add insult to injury, the Democrats had spent heavily in North Carolina to make it a respectable loss and save face for Edwards. The Democrats chose to believe that Gore's loss in the South had been an aberration. Going by a material time-quality analysis, this led them on a path to disaster. They were punished for their mismanagement of financial resources, their failure to recognize a trend quickly enough, and for their poor choice of battlefield. If they had properly interpreted the loss of the entire South in 2000 as the trend it clearly turned out to be, they might have selected Dick Gephardt instead of Edwards. The addition of the Midwestern stalwart would have created a good chance of flipping Iowa and Missouri, and changing their 18 electoral votes from red to blue, providing Kerry with a 269 to 268 victory over Bush, despite the loss of Ohio. Gore's near miss in 2000 lulled the Kerry campaign into believing nothing essential had changed in 2004. In one way, they were correct. The only change in the 2004 electoral map from that of 2000 was that the Democrats swapped the gain of New Hampshire for the loss of New Mexico and Iowa. But more than anything, the Kerry campaign had lost sight of the point. They refought the losing battles of 2000 instead of seeking out new tactical advantages. They looked at the 2000 map and chose to fight the trend it represented, instead of looking for new opportunities, such as going after the Midwest with a vice presidential candidate from Missouri. To be fair, the point is that nobody knows for sure when a change is a trend until it's already too late. Political operatives and marketing executives are paid a lot of money to process the available information and make the right choices. Inevitably, somebody has to be wrong. In the 2006 U.S. midterm elections, for example, both the Democrats and the Republicans bet everything on the issue of the war in Iraq. Most polls showed it was a loser issue for Republicans and the Bush administration. But Karl Rove and other GOP strategists were convinced they had enough votes in key races to keep control of Congress. However, the tough talk and support the troops rhetoric that was so successful for Republicans in 2004 was a failure in 2006. Even some moderate Republicans who had stopped supporting Bush on Iraq were swept from office by the anti-war tide that some Republicans had underestimated as just a wave. Distinguishing between an anomaly and a movement can't be done with polls and data alone. We have to focus our attention on any new event and extend all our senses. What exactly makes it new? In what ways is it like something we have seen before? How has the environment changed? If we can answer these questions, we will have an excellent chance of knowing whether a single snowflake is about to become a blizzard. Chapter 15. Crisis Point. Everything is condensed into one single moment. It decides our life. Franz Kafka. One single moment. What would intimidate you more? Being told, solve this problem, or being told, find out if there's a problem? Solving problems could be described as easy compared to figuring out whether there is a problem in the first place. It's hard to say we're lucky when we face a crisis, but we at least have the luxury of knowing that action is called for, of being forced to move. The truest tests of skill and intuition come when everything looks quiet and we aren't sure what to do, or if we should do anything at all. Anyone who has sat for a multiple-choice exam knows the most feared option is none of the above. Suddenly, it's open-ended. Maybe there is no solution at all, who knows? Try this short mathematics test, which won't require a calculator. 13 times 63 equals A. 109, B. 819, C. 8,109. No doubt at all, of course, the answer is found by a simple process of elimination. Our intuition tells us instantly that we don't have to calculate anything. But if we add D, none of the above, we have to do the work and solve the equation, no matter how obviously wrong answers A and C are. We touched on this earlier in our discussion of composed chess puzzles. In these puzzles, you are presented with a position and stipulations. White to checkmate in 3 moves is precise. White to play and win is more open-ended. But in both cases, we know before we start that there is something to be found. Relieved of the need to evaluate and be vigilant, we turn the matter over to the problem-solving section of our brain. In such cases, we can perform these tasks with remarkable efficiency. In 1987, I was invited to a special reception in Frankfurt held by Atari. All of their managers were there, and the master of ceremonies was the head of their German division, Alwin Stumpf. It was an informal and entertaining evening where we discussed politics as well as chess and computers. In fact, I earned the friendly condescension of most everyone, with my prediction that as a consequence of the changes in the USSR, the Berlin Wall would soon fall, perhaps in as little as 5 years. A fine chess player, everyone said, but he doesn't know anything about politics. As it turns out, my forecast allowed 3 years too many. After the banquet was finished, Herr Stumpf took the microphone and grandly pronounced that we were about to see something extraordinary. He had seen me perform an amazing feat on television, and now I was going to do it in person. I had no idea what he had in mind when he pointed to a long table on the other side of the room that we had passed on the way in. Stumpf explained that the table held a dozen chessboards, each set up to reflect a position from a historic game of chess spanning 150 years of play. In front of each board, a face-down card listed the date, place, and names of the players. I was to be tested to see if I could identify each game by looking at the position on the board. Stumpf walked over to the table and invited me to join him so the challenge could begin. When I remained in my seat, a look of fear crossed his face. He was clearly worried that he had gravely insulted me with his little surprise. I said, "I'm honored you are interested in understanding the human mind, but I hope you will forgive me if I stay seated." Stumpf looked forlorn. I was going to ruin his big moment. But then I said that I couldn't help glancing at the boards as we had walked into the hall, and that I would like to try to name all the games from here, in my chair across the room. So, one by one, I named the players, the tournament, and even the next move of each game represented on the dozen boards. The effect was satisfactorily jaw-dropping for the guests, and looking back on it, I try to forgive myself a youthful display of the dramatic. What I did not explain, and likely didn't even realize at the time myself, was that they had made it easy for me. Not with the game selection, because not all of the positions were even taken from world-famous encounters. But of course, each position they had selected was from the critical moment of each game. No self-respecting chess fan would select a nondescript position from a deservedly forgotten game when there are so many fascinating and famous positions to choose from. It was enough to know that since the first position was the key moment of a known game from history, the others were likely similar. Had the positions appeared uninteresting or trivial, I would perhaps have assumed the participants had been playing some casual games before I arrived. When I glanced at the boards, I quickly recognized that I didn't have to evaluate the positions. All I had to do was look them up in my memory. Knowing a solution is at hand is a huge advantage. It's like not having a none-of-the-above option. Anyone with reasonable competence and adequate resources can solve a puzzle when it is presented as something to be solved. We can skip the subtle evaluations and move directly to plugging in possible solutions until we hit upon a promising one. Uncertainty is far more challenging. Instead of immediately looking for solutions to the crisis, we have to maintain a constant state of asking, is there a crisis forming? Detecting a crisis before it's a crisis. Detecting a crisis in the making is a separate skill from solving one. Here I'm distinguishing crisis from catastrophe. It doesn't take much skill or intuition to realize when things have gone horribly wrong. In a 1959 speech in Indianapolis, John F. Kennedy famously observed that the Chinese word for crisis is composed of two characters, one meaning danger and the other meaning opportunity. Though this turns out not to be literally true, it is a poetic and memorable way to illustrate a useful concept. I was somewhat surprised to discover that the English definition of the word is also illustrative. From its common usage, we might assume it means something like disaster, which needs no further synonyms. But in fact, crisis really means a turning point, a critical moment when the stakes are high and the outcome uncertain. It also implies a point of no return. This signifies both danger and opportunity, so Kennedy's speech was accurate where it mattered. Great success with minimal risk of failure is a goal held by many, especially in the modern political and commercial environment. It may even be achievable if you have many advantages to start with, the way an heir to a fortune does when he enters a business. And it would be pleasant, if boring, to forever take our boat down calm and straight streams, never encountering rapids or bends in the course. But for most of us, avoiding crises entirely, which often only means postponing them, or worse, ignoring them altogether, carries a great risk of its own. Instead, real success depends on detecting, evaluating, and controlling risk. Of these three things, detection is often the most important, and always the most difficult. Important because without it, instead of controlling risk, we end up fighting to survive when the crisis hits. Difficult because it requires alertness to the most subtle changes. World champion Boris Spassky once observed, "The best indicator of a chess player's form is his ability to sense the climax of the game." It is virtually impossible to play the best move every single turn, because accuracy comes at the expense of time, and vice versa. But if we can detect the key moments, we can make our best decisions when they matter most. The moves we make on the chessboard are far from equal in importance, and you must rely on intuition to tell you that here, at this precise moment, you need to spend some extra time because the game may hinge on this one decision. Apart from its merit as an indicator of good or poor form, the ability to detect these crisis points is a gauge of overall strength in a chess player and in a decision-maker. The greatest players are distinguished by their ability to recognize crucial factors that are both specific and general. Analysis of past games illustrates this well, despite the challenges I referred to earlier of comprehending today what was going on through the mind of someone 100 years ago. We can't be positive that Lasker knew a certain move was the climax of the game, but we can tell from analyzing his play when he found the best moves and when he didn't. Usually, we also know how much time the players invested in each move. Learning from a crisis. Chateaubriand wrote, "Moments of crisis produce a redoubling of life in man." These are the times when we are tested, when we develop our skills and our senses. Take a moment to look back on your last crisis and how you handled it. If you cannot recall a recent crisis in your life, even one successfully averted, you are either lucky, bored, or both. It is not pure bravado that leads some individuals to constantly push themselves and those around them to the breaking point in pursuit of conflict. Times of conflict can create opportunities that would never otherwise exist. Provoking a crisis requires perfect timing if you plan to survive the consequences. You can have the other key factors on your side, material and quality, and still be ruined if you misjudge the prevailing environment. A final chess story, The Crisis in Seville. I can look back at my chess career and pick out more than a few crisis points, but only one Mount Everest. I would like to share the tale to investigate the means I used in winning the most important game of my life. After winning the World Championship in 1985, I had little time to savor the taste of victory. The traditional cycle called for a title defense every 3 years. During that time, the challenger would be produced by rigorous qualification through regional tournaments, giant interzonal tournaments, and finally, a series of candidate matches. This was so grueling that a challenger in the final was undoubtedly a worthy contender. In fact, since the qualification system began in 1950, when it was just a single tournament, only 2 players who reached a world championship match have failed to become champion eventually. This process was interrupted in my case, however, thanks to the rematch clause, a defunct rule that FIDE resurrected in the 70s under Soviet pressure to favor Karpov. If the champion lost, he had the right to an automatic rematch a year later with no qualification process. This rule had been abolished after Botvinnik, who had poor scores in world championship matches but was devastating in the rematches, used it to reclaim the title he lost to Smyslov in 1957 and then Tal in 1960. To avoid the same fate, I would have to beat Karpov again in 1986. Bear in mind that we had already played the longest championship match in history in 1984-85, then played another grueling match in 1985 in which I took the title. I narrowly won the rematch in 1986, but the ordeal was still not over. The qualification cycle had started on schedule in 1985, despite our canceled marathon match, the rescheduled match, and the rematch. This meant that I was due to face the scheduled challenger in 1987, exactly a year after beating Karpov. And who would my opponent be this time? Karpov. Evading the main qualification process, my nemesis had been dropped into a super final and had duly demolished the leading contender, Andrei Sokolov. In October 1987, we sat down in Seville, Spain, to begin our 4th World Championship match in 3 years. If I had thought I was tired of looking at Karpov back in 1984, I was really sick of him by now. At least this time, there were no more tricks. If I won this match, I wouldn't have to see him or any other title challenger for another 3 years. Apart from the freedom from the exhausting battle of the match itself, this also meant not having to endure the months of intense preparation that always precede such a match. Must-win strategy. Perhaps my eagerness to avoid playing another match with Karpov for another 3 years is what led to such a turbulent start to our match in Seville. 4 of the first 8 games were decisive, 2 wins each, and 4 draws. I was disappointed with my uneven play and my inability to put any distance between us. After a terrible Karpov blunder, I won the 11th game from a dubious position to take the lead for the first time in the match, scheduled for 24 games. After 4 draws, Karpov won the 16th game to draw even. At this point, I began to think only of my title. A 12-12 score, a drawn match, would allow me to retain the championship. Hardly the convincing victory I had hoped for to end our marathon, but beggars cannot be choosers. And more important, a draw would give me 3 years of peace. I went into defensive mode and stopped pressing him. A stretch of 6 quite uneventful draws followed, setting up a showdown in the final 2 games. I didn't want to push, and Karpov didn't have the energy to do so. 2 more draws seemed the most logical result. Members of my analysis team thought so too. They didn't tell me about their side wagers until after the match had ended. But Grandmaster Zurab Azmaiparashvili made a bet against Grandmaster Joseph Dorfman on the last 2 games, giving away phenomenal odds for any outcome other than 2 more draws. It would have done my heart a great deal of good had Dorfman lost his bet. But unfortunately, the string of draws would end at 6. After a tough, prolonged defense, I suffered one of the worst hallucinations of my career and blundered to a loss in Game 23. Suddenly, Karpov was up by a point and was only a draw away from taking back the crown he had lost to me 2 years earlier. The very next day after this catastrophe, I had to take the white pieces into a must-win Game 24. Kaisa, the goddess of chess, had punished me for my conservative play, for betraying my nature. I would not be allowed to hold on to my title without winning a game in the second half of the match. Only once before in chess history had the champion won a final game to retain his title. With his back against the wall, Emanuel Lasker beat Karl Schlechter in the last game of their match in 1910. The win allowed Lasker to draw the match and keep his title for a further 11 years. The Austrian Schlechter had, like Karpov, a reputation as a defensive wizard. In fact, his uncharacteristically aggressive play in the final game against Lasker has led some historians to believe that the rules of that particular match required him to win by 2 points. In 1985, the situation had been reversed. I had gone into the final game leading by a point, and Karpov needed to win to tie the match and save the title he had held since 1975. As discussed in Chapter 2, in that decisive game, Karpov started out with an all-or-nothing attack. At the critical moment, he was betrayed by his own instincts and failed to find the best moves. He had started out the game playing in my direct style, only to slow down to his own more cautious approach in midstream, with predictably poor results. When preparing for my turn on the other side of this situation, I recalled that critical encounter. What strategy should I employ with the white pieces in this must-win final game? There was more to think about than Game 23 and Game 24, of course. These were also Games 119 and 120 between us. An extraordinary number of top-level encounters between the same 2 players, all played in a span of 39 months. It felt like one long match, with this final game in December 1987 the climax of what we had started in September 1984. My plan for the final game had to consider not only what I would like best, but what my opponent would like least. And what could be more annoying for Karpov than my turning the tables and playing like Karpov? Errors on both sides. Had I not battled against Karpov for 119 games, I would have been incapable of surviving the all-important 120th. The loss of Game 23 itself had the potential to be crushing, and I had less than 24 hours to prepare what could be my last game as World Chess Champion. The secret of my preparation? Playing cards with my team and getting a good 5 or 6 hours of sleep. The aggregate score of our World Championship marathon was 16 wins apiece and 87 draws. Victory in this 120th game would mean not only winning this match, but taking the lead in our overall score. So why cards and sleep instead of opening preparation? After 119 games with Karpov, there was nothing my team and I were going to uncover in a few hours of anxious analysis. We decided on a basic strategy, nothing more than that. The rest of the time was better spent recovering my nervous and physical energy for the battle ahead. This might sound strange, given my typically obsessive preparation, but it was a simple matter of allocation of resources. Here I would be best served to trade time for quality. The strategy I had chosen would require not explosive energy, but a slow burn. The magnificent Teatro Lope de Vega was packed for Game 24. The entire game was shown live on Spanish television. The usual pre-game murmur of the audience had been replaced by a low roar. I was later told that the excited Spanish radio and television commentators sounded as if they were covering the final round of a heavyweight boxing match, which in a sense they were. The arbiter started my clock, and I pushed my c-pawn forward 2 squares, just as I had done 8 times previously in the match. The difference would come in the next few moves, as I kept my center pawns back and instead developed on the flanks, carefully avoiding a do-or-die battle. I opened slowly, even a little passively, to keep as many pieces as possible on the board. This technique would put psychological pressure on Karpov, despite his expertise in such maneuvers. With no clear forcing continuations, he would constantly be tempted to simplify and exchange pieces even at the cost of a slightly inferior position. Obviously, with fewer pieces on the board, the level of complexity would drop, reducing the chances of a decisive result. But as long as I could put a sufficiently high quality price tag on these exchanges, I felt I was getting good value. My slow cook method had the additional advantage of getting Karpov into serious time trouble. With the stakes so high, he was being extra cautious, taking valuable minutes to double-check moves he would normally make quickly. As the game progressed, Karpov exchanged half the pieces, but his position was still under uncomfortable pressure. He was so close to equalizing on every move, but he couldn't quite get his head above water. In the meantime, his clock was becoming a factor. Seeing a chance to play for an attack, I moved my knight to the central e5 square, offering a pawn. Karpov took the bait and grabbed the pawn, a temptation that could have led to disaster. And he had to play quickly now, as it was still a long way to move 40, when, by the rules then in force, the game would be adjourned and more time added before continuation the next day. Today, mostly due to the players using computers to help them analyze, such adjournments are obsolete. I exchanged rooks, leaving me with queen, knight, and bishop against his queen and 2 knights. He had an extra pawn, but I had seen a tactical possibility that would give me a powerful attack. His pieces were dangerously uncoordinated, and his king was vulnerable. If I could penetrate into his position with my queen, I could exploit both of these factors at the same time. The question was, where to move my queen on move 33? Karpov could only wait, knowing he would have to reply almost immediately, or he wouldn't have enough time to make the next 8 moves without losing on time. Lost in thought, I was startled by a tap on my shoulder. The Dutch arbiter leaned over and said, "Mr. Kasparov, you have to write the moves." I had become so wrapped up in the game that I had forgotten to make note of the last 2 moves on my score sheet, as required by the rules. The arbiter was, of course, correct to remind me of the regulations, but what a moment to be strict. Distracted, I played my queen to the wrong square. I missed a subtlety and failed to see why a different move with the same idea would have been stronger. My move gave Karpov a clever defense, and suddenly he was 1 move from reclaiming his title. But under pressure from the clock, he missed the best move, though our exchange of errors would not be discovered until well after the game, and the momentum was still with me. Karpov's best opportunity to defend had passed, and my forces surrounded the Black King. I regained my sacrificed pawn with interest, and by the time we reached move 40, ending the time scramble, my position was clearly superior. The game was adjourned until the next day with the title still up in the air. It was going to be a long night. Keeping a grip on the title. Getting a good night's sleep before the game had been wise, but now there was work to do. 13 pieces were still on the board, including queens. Too much material for definitive endgame analysis. I had an extra pawn, but with such limited material, Karpov had definite chances of a draw. A lot of chess was still ahead. We spent the night investigating possible defensives and how to break them down. Before the game, I gave my chances as 50-50, 50% chance of a win, 50% chance of a draw. The best news was that I could play this position forever, maneuvering around to provoke a mistake by my opponent. Black would be tied down on defense the entire time, and Karpov knew it. The prospect of such prolonged torture took its toll. I could see it in his eyes when he walked on the stage a few minutes after I did. His fatalistic expression told me that he had already lost the game psychologically, which boosted my confidence. The maneuvering began. I remember being surprised when early on, Karpov made a pawn push that my team and I had established as bad for Black's defensive chances. Apparently, Karpov and his team disagreed with our analysis, or perhaps it was a psychological error. Sometimes the hardest thing to do in a pressure situation is to allow the tension to persist. The temptation is to make a decision, any decision, even if it is an inferior choice. And Karpov's move made the position more concrete, reducing the level of uncertainty. But in my favor, his structure was now fixed, presenting me with clearer targets. Convinced of the quality of our analysis, I took Karpov's significant deviation from it as a mistake, not a potential improvement, further increasing my confidence. After another 10 moves of steady squeezing, I began to feel the win was in the bag. Karpov's pieces were pinned up against the wall, and a little more maneuvering would lead to decisive material gain. Later, I heard that FIDE President Florencio Campomanes was busy calling a special meeting in another room to decide how to handle the closing ceremony, which was scheduled to be held on the same day. But it still looked as if this game could last forever. What was to be done? 2 crises were averted at once when someone ran into the meeting room to announce, "Karpov resigned." It was without question the loudest and longest standing ovation I had ever received outside my native country. The theater thundered as Spanish television cut from football to broadcast the conclusion of the match. I had done what Karpov had failed to do in 1985, won the final game, and drawn the match to retain my title. This time, I would have a good long time to enjoy it. I left the Seville stage and jumped into the arms of one of my team members, shouting, 3 years! I have 3 years! Sadly, time does not stop at these moments, no matter how much we might wish it to. Those 3 years passed faster than I could have imagined until we were there again, Karpov and I, face to face, in our 5th straight World Championship match. Our epic duels have formed a part of chess history that most of today's top players grew up watching. By the end of that last match in 1990, yet another narrow win for me. Our career scores against each other were close, and yet in every encounter, in each match, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Seville, Lyon, at each decisive moment, I had won. This means more to me than any statistic about wins and losses. It means I performed my best when it mattered most. Endgame. The fight in Russia today. On March 10, 2005, I played my last professional game of chess. 30 years after I played my first major event at the national level, nearly 20 years after I became world champion, I retired at the age of 41. I left after winning my final tournament in my beloved Linares, and still as the top-ranked player in the game, inevitably leading to numerous why inquiries from all quarters. Faithful to my own preaching, I had looked deeply at this critical move. This was not a spontaneous move, but a logical step. My shift to becoming a full-time member of the Russian political opposition movement reflected both the needs of my country and my desire to make a difference in the world around me. I was fortunate to have attained most of the ambitious goals I had set for myself in the chess world. New challenges and new ways to make an impact were waiting for me in politics, and I hoped, in writing. One of the constant themes of this audio program has been how essential it is to continually challenge ourselves. The only way to develop is to venture into the unknown, to take risks, and to learn new things. We must force ourselves out of our comfort zone and trust our ability to adapt and thrive. Everything that I have said here led me to retire from the chess world. I craved new challenges, and wanted to be where I felt I was wanted and needed. In fighting for the survival of Russia's fragile democracy, I found a precious cause, a worthy challenge, and a new way to channel my energy. This decision was not about running for higher office, nor was it a personal vendetta against Vladimir Putin or anyone else. Mine is a mission of positive change. Putin is only the current symbol of what we are fighting against. I don't want my 10-year-old son to worry about Russian military service in an illegal war such as Chechnya, or to fear the repression of a dictatorship. I want to have a chance to offer my vision, strategic thought, and fighting spirit to prevent those things from happening. Many go on to ask about the dangers of opposing this Kremlin regime, and if this is a foolhardy move. After all, having his father attacked or jailed won't be of much benefit to my son. To this I can only say that some things must simply be done. Succeed or fail, this is a fight that must be fought. As the Soviet dissidents famously put it, do what you must, and so be it. Millions like me in Russia want a free press, the rule of law, social justice, and free and fair elections. My new job is to fight for those people and to fight for those fundamental rights. To achieve these ends, my colleagues and I have formed a broad, non-ideological coalition of true opposition groups and activists. I am working inside Russia and abroad to bring attention to the decimation of Russia's democratic institutions. My chess fame and the skills I developed in the chess world have proven equally vital to this task. My hope is that in this audio program, I have managed to pass along some of the wisdom and strategies I've learned, and that you, too, will find ways to use the world's greatest game to your every advantage. Your life is your preparation. What we make of the future is defined by how well we understand and make use of our past. Our past creates a map not only of where we have come from, but of where we are going. On it are marked the things we have valued and the places we have found success or failure. But the most wondrous thing about this map is that vast portions of it are yet to be filled in. With insight and effort, we can trace new routes to our own satisfaction. The next part of my life will contain many new challenges. I have new goals, new people in my life, and I have left behind the only vocation I have ever known. And yet, as foreign as this new course seemed at first, my life in chess has left me well prepared. I ask myself, how can I be afraid of a mere KGB lieutenant colonel after overcoming an Olympus of chess champions? Why should my nerves fail me in front of heads of state or CEOs of multinational corporations when I have spent my entire life on stage? After a lifetime of preparation and self-examination, I believe I have the tools I need to adapt to this new struggle. There are new strategies, new tactics, and I don't expect the transition to always be smooth. My personal map is full of gray areas, and its outer borders are never entirely complete. Most important, I have learned not to fear those unknown territories. My 10-year-old son, Vadim, is reaching the age where my own childhood memories are vivid. While his life will, of course, be very different from mine, I dearly hope to provide him the guidance I know my father would have continued to provide me. After a hectic life, I was fortunate to meet Dasha, now my friend, supporter, and wife. Above all, I'm infinitely grateful that the same person who guided me through my first career, my mother, Clara, is again with me at the start of my second. Whenever I'm faced with a difficult path, her words inspire me. If not you, who else? No more secrets. The purpose of this audio program is to inspire fellow explorers. We can all look at our personal maps and cast off for unknown domains where we will encounter new challenges. We can accept that failure is a necessary part of success. The faith that led Magellan to attempt to circumnavigate the globe in 1519 is why we remember him. But few remember that he was not among the 18 survivors who completed the journey. Like any explorer, we must first plan our route, our strategy. Then we must marshal our resources, allocating them carefully while obtaining what we need and discarding any excess. Once underway, we need to maintain a sharp tactical eye by never backing away from conflict unless we are certain it best suits our needs to do so. Remaining alert for dangers and opportunities should not be allowed to distract us from our course. We must at all times be aware of changes in our environment, looking for chances to make positive exchanges that will take advantage of new conditions. Above all, we must be conscious of every decision we make, not only in evaluating each future course of action, but in looking back to analyze our past choices and the effectiveness of the process by which we made them. Instead of making us weary, our explorations should energize us, suffusing us with new confidence and inspiration. Our senses are sharpened, and unknown challenges soon become a sight more welcome than a familiar routine. New stimuli develop our intuition. We see the trends forming, the big picture, and the details stay in focus at the same time. The dots become easier to connect. When a crisis comes, our instincts serve as an early warning system. If we are caught by surprise, our reflexes give us the chance to take the offensive instead of playing defense. Nearly 20 years ago, I concluded a precocious autobiography with these words: "Time after time, as I've outgrown another problem or defeated another opponent, I have seen that the main battles are yet to come. My fight is open-ended. Now I know this fight wasn't only with the Soviet Sports Committee, or FIDE, or the Kremlin, but also with my own abilities and limitations. Our energies can be directed toward taking responsibility for our fates, toward creating change and making a difference. How success is measured is different for each of us. The first and most important step is realizing that the secret of success is inside." Epilogue. A Strategy for Democracy. At the end of 2006, as this book was headed to the printer in several countries, the internal political chaos in Russia spilled out into the world's headlines. A British national, KGB agent defector, and harsh critic of the Kremlin, Alexander Litvinenko, was assassinated with the rare radioactive substance polonium-210. The investigation into his death currently spans at least 3 countries. Litvinenko's murder came on the heels of the Moscow killing of the well-known investigative journalist Anna Politkovskaya on Russian President Vladimir Putin's birthday, no less. The killings have turned a spotlight on what the West had assumed was the autocratic but stable Putin regime. Suddenly, the foreign media is realizing what we in the Russian opposition have been saying for years. The Kremlin is ever closer to dictatorship than democracy, and yet is not stable at all. This interest has led to a corresponding increase in attention to my own role in the opposition movement, and to questions about how my former career as a chess champion has aided my mission. With that in mind, my publisher wondered if it would be appropriate to include some last-minute comments about how I have applied the lessons presented in this book to my political fight in Russia. But this epilogue is more than a topical convenience. While writing this book and preparing my business lectures, I have discovered a great deal about synthesizing these lessons and using them in practice. It is quite accurate to say that I have been learning from my own book, confirming the old adage that the best way to learn a topic is to teach it. The most important and most difficult element on my new political agenda was developing a strategy that would pump life into the anti-Putin forces. It was like sitting down to a chess game already in progress and discovering my side was close to checkmate in every variation. I could immediately draw a parallel to my first World Championship match, the 1984-85 marathon against Anatoly Karpov. There, I spent months a step away from total disaster, a situation that required an entirely new strategy, one based more on survival than triumph. I did it. I survived to fight another day, and the next time we met, I was victorious. The anti-Kremlin forces were in a similarly dire state in 2004. Unfortunately, in this game, our opponents changed the rules regularly and always to their advantage. But even in this unpredictable and unfair contest, a good strategy gives us a fighting chance. I started with the fundamentals of planning, a thorough evaluation of the position and the determination of its most vital elements. Finding the outlines of the big picture came first. It was necessary to sort out allies from enemies, an easy enough task in the black and white world of the chessboard, but far more complex in the gray realm of politics. Two things eventually became clear to me. First, that the continued existence of organized opposition to Putin's crackdown was in no way guaranteed. We needed to dig in to survive, or risk being pushed completely off the board. There is no losing with grace or reaching a peaceful accord with such an opponent. When facing an authoritarian regime bent on total control, every day you endure sends out a message of hope. We're still here. With no access to television and other state-controlled media, it was essential for us to find other ways to get out those vital words. Second was the need to form a coalition. The opposition was in disarray, small political and non-governmental groups, each with its own issues with the government. Despite the numerous causes and ideologies represented, I became convinced that we needed to unite, to find common cause against the repression. The one thing we all had in common was the knowledge that democracy was our only salvation. Liberals, communists, human rights activists, we all believed and continue to believe that given a choice in a fair election, the Russian people will reject Putin's attempt to turn our country back into a police state. This move did not arise spontaneously. My first steps were as the co-founder and chairman of the Committee 2008, Free Choice in January 2004. This was a coalition of like-minded liberals and members of the media, that is, not just politicians, dedicated to ensuring free and fair elections in 2008, when Putin's second and constitutionally final term of office ends. My work there convinced me that Russia's problems were too big to solve from any internal or ideological stance. In this book, I discuss the tendency to discover problems that cannot be solved from within the available framework, and here was such a problem. Negotiations were used to gain political capital that was traded for superficial concessions by the Kremlin, a process that only perpetuated the corrupt system and made us a part of it. To have a real impact, it was necessary to focus on the core issue. You were either working with the Kremlin or dedicated to dismantling the regime. Similar ideas about uniting were already in the air, and they led to the formation of the All-Russia Civil Congress in December 2004, and I was elected co-chair. I had been observing the dissatisfaction of the activists on every side. They were tired of dancing to Putin's tune while watching their party leaders cut deals for paltry handouts. The Civil Congress was conceived as a unifying platform, but it fell short when forces from both sides of the political spectrum were as of yet unable to leave behind the Yeltsin-era Civil War mentality and to work alongside their traditional adversaries. My greatest contribution would be to help bridge this gap. In March 2005, I retired from professional chess and could plan my next tactical maneuver on the political front. A major obstacle was that the ruling administration controlled all access to television. Without access, the political grassroots were dying out all over the country. We needed to find a way to reach out beyond the Garden Ring, the wealthy center of Moscow. We needed an organization that would unify the opposition groups across the ideological divides, as well as develop our nationwide network of activists. This new organization was the United Civil Front, UCF, and under this banner, I traveled Russia from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad to spread our message, to talk about why the countryside was so poor and the elites so rich. And most important, to say that it was not too late to come together and fight for our civil liberties and democracy, because only those things would improve the deteriorating standard of living. This mixing of opposition groups has also had several positive side effects. The leftists, and those still mourning the Soviet Union, have come to recognize the importance of liberal democracy and political freedom. The liberals have learned to accept the need for the social programs touted by the left. Unity has not only stiffened the opposition to the Putin government, but has also clarified and advanced the specific goals of our member groups. Each of these entities contributed to my education. I was learning quickly, and we were making progress, but we still needed to reach a larger audience both inside and outside Russia. It was time to go on the offensive. The Group of 8, 7 by my count, held a summit in St. Petersburg in the summer of 2006, and the leaders and media of the free world would be in Russia. It provided a golden opportunity to unite and also to get our message out. We organized a convention in Moscow, an international conference that brought activists from all over Russia to share ideas and support. We also invited the international media and speakers from all over the world who were not afraid to speak strongly for democracy in the shadow of the Kremlin. My All-Russia Civil Congress co-chairs and I wrote countless letters of invitation, calling in favors, and twisting arms when necessary. Eventually, many prominent figures contributed statements of support, although few G8 administrations had the courage to openly endorse us. We titled our event, The Other Russia Conference, so named to tell the world that the stable democratic Russia Putin presented was not reality. We knew we had achieved significant progress when the administration made efforts to harass us at every turn. If this is truly a measure of success, I should be proud that the humble UCF offices were raided by security forces this month, a few days prior to our December 16th march in Moscow. The Other Russia movement has united the Russian opposition, and although our situation is still precarious, we have succeeded in forcefully promoting ourselves into an important piece on the political chessboard. The development of the Russian opposition has occurred in parallel with my own evolution as a political thinker. The United Civil Front added political clout to the concept of the All-Russia Civil Congress. It all finally came together, literally and figuratively, in the Other Russia. As unfavorable as our position may still be, my evaluation of our opponents' forces discovered that they are not without their own weaknesses. Unlike the old Soviet regime, this ruling elite has a great deal at stake outside Russia. Their fortunes are in banks, stock markets, real estate, and football teams, predominantly foreign. This means they are vulnerable to external pressure. They literally cannot afford the cutting of ties that would come with open hostility between an increasingly dictatorial Russia and the West. So far, however, it has been difficult to convince the so-called leaders of the free world and the free press to bring such pressure to bear. Putin uses Russia's energy wealth as a cudgel, and Europe's leaders meekly fall in line. Thus, the third element of my strategy has been to expose this hypocrisy in as many editorial pages as I can reach. This plan is not so short-sighted as to not keep in mind the potential consequences. It is essential to maintain our coalition because if the increasingly shaky Putin regime collapses due to internal conflict, it could lead to total chaos. It is worth remembering that just 15 years ago, the mighty Soviet regime disintegrated, much to the surprise of Western intelligence agencies. We have to always look ahead enough moves to be well prepared, even for victory. We hope you have enjoyed How Life Imitates Chess, Making the Right Moves from the Board to the Boardroom, an Audio Renaissance audiobook from Bloomsbury, USA. Text copyright 2007 by Gary Kasparov. Production copyright 2007 by Audio Renaissance, a division of Holt Spring Publishers, LLC. All rights reserved.